performance feature nobody knew how to control. At first, it was celebrated as the missing piece, the breakthrough that finally separated good performance cars from truly great ones. Yet almost nobody understood how quickly that same feature would begin rewriting behavior in ways no engineer had intended. It didn't fail mechanically. It succeeded too efficiently, creating a gap between what drivers thought they were controlling and what the system was actually deciding for them. To understand why this performance feature became so problematic, we have to go back to a moment when technology crossed a subtle threshold, when assistants stopped acting like support and started behaving like authority. Quietly assuming responsibilities drivers never realized they had surrendered. The feature wasn't designed to dominate the experience, but it became central so quickly that everything else began orbiting around it. On launch, the excitement was immediate. Reviewers praised how effortlessly the car extracted speed. Lap times dropped. Consistency improved. Drivers felt empowered, as if they had unlocked a new level of ability without needing years of refinement or discipline. The feature intervened seamlessly, redistributing forces, correcting trajectories, and smoothing inputs so effectively that it blurred the line between driver intention and system interpretation. At moderate use, it felt magical. The car exited corners with impossible traction. Acceleration felt clean regardless of surface. Mistakes disappeared before drivers could even register them. But that invisibility was the danger, because drivers weren't learning how to control the car. They were learning how to trigger the system. Inputs became more aggressive. Margins shrank quietly. Confidence expanded faster than understanding. What few people noticed early on was how the feature changed decision-making. Drivers stopped planning ahead. They reacted later. They trusted correction instead of preparation. The car still felt stable, still felt fast, still felt safe, and that reinforced the illusion that control had improved. Engineers began seeing strange patterns during extended testing. Drivers were faster, but less consistent without the system. When it disengaged, even briefly, performance collapsed abruptly. It became clear that the feature wasn't just assisting control, it was replacing it. Yet no one knew how to explain that without sounding alarmist, because the feature was doing exactly what it promised, delivering performance beyond what most drivers could achieve alone. The problem was that once drivers relied on it, they no longer knew where their own limits ended, and that uncertainty would soon become impossible to ignore. As reliance on the feature increased, something subtle but deeply important began to change in how drivers interacted with the car, because control was no longer something they actively managed, but something they assumed would always be there waiting beneath their decisions. The feature worked so consistently, so quietly, that drivers stopped treating it as assistance and started treating it as an extension of themselves. That shift altered behavior almost immediately. Corner entries became more aggressive. Throttle applications became sharper. Recovery techniques faded from memory. Drivers weren't reckless. They were confident. The feature corrected y'all before it became visible, redistributed torque before traction was lost, and stabilized exits so cleanly that mistakes never felt like mistakes at all. Each successful intervention reinforced a belief that the system could always handle just a little more. But the system was never designed for belief. It was designed for boundaries. Engineers noticed that drivers began timing inputs around the feature's behavior rather than around physics, effectively driving the software instead of the car. They learned how hard they could push before intervention, how aggressively they could accelerate before correction, and how late they could brake before stability stepped in. This wasn't mastery. It was dependency. The most concerning discovery came during controlled testing. When the feature was reduced, delayed, or disabled, drivers struggled immediately, overcorrecting inputs and misjudging grip because their instincts had been recalibrated around assistance rather than reality. They had become fast inside a narrow bubble and fragile outside it. Instructors described the phenomenon clearly. Drivers had outsourced judgment. They no longer felt the buildup of limit. They no longer recognized warning signals. They waited for correction instead of preventing instability in the first place. The feature had trained them to react later. That delay was harmless until conditions changed. Wet surfaces, uneven pavement, unexpected inputs. In those moments, the system reached thresholds it could not extend. And when it did, the handover back to the driver felt abrupt and unforgiving because the driver's internal timing no longer matched reality. The feature hadn't removed risk, it had rearranged it. By shifting responsibility away from anticipation and toward correction, it created drivers who were exceptionally capable when supported and dangerously unprepared when that support faded even slightly. And that contradiction was about to force a difficult conversation, because a performance feature nobody knew how to control had quietly become a feature that controlled them instead. The conflict became undeniable once the feature reached environments it was never meant to dominate, because while it thrived in controlled scenarios, it struggled when unpredictability entered the equation, and the driver was expected to retake authority instantly. That moment of handover, subtle on paper and violent in reality, exposed just how deeply drivers had adapted themselves around the system rather than around the car itself. Drivers described the same sensation repeatedly: a sudden emptiness, a loss of reference, an overwhelming sense that something essential had vanished. The feature had been managing transitions so smoothly that drivers no longer felt the buildup of instability, and when it stepped back, the return of raw physics felt abrupt, almost unfair. Steering felt heavier, throttle felt sharper. Consequences arrived faster than expected. What shocked engineers most was how universal the response was. Experienced drivers struggled. Casual drivers froze. Confidence evaporated instantly. The feature had created a false continuity, a belief that control was constant rather than conditional, and once that illusion shattered, panic replaced planning. Recovery required instincts that had not been practiced for years, because the system had quietly handled those moments in the background. Training programs attempted to adapt. Drivers were encouraged to practice without assistance. Modes were added to reduce intervention gradually. The results were mixed. Some drivers relearned fundamentals. Others avoided disengaging the system entirely, because once dependency forms, removal feels like punishment. Manufacturers face a dilemma. Removing the feature reduced appeal. Keeping it unchanged increased risk. So compromises followed. Warnings appeared earlier. Transitions became more noticeable. Feedback was amplified intentionally. The feature was no longer allowed to disappear silently. These changes didn't make the system worse. They made it honest, but honesty arrived late. The damage had already been done for a generation of drivers who had learned performance through delegation instead of discipline. They were fast, but brittle, capable only within the narrow conditions where the feature could perform perfectly. This was no longer just a technical problem. It was a behavioral one. The feature had proven something uncomfortable, that when control feels invisible, responsibility fades quietly with it. And once responsibility fades, no amount of performance can restore it instantly. That realization pushed the industry toward a hard truth. The question was never whether the feature worked. It was whether it taught drivers how to exist without it. And for many, the answer was already clear. The lesson this feature left behind was not about technology failing, but about education being quietly replaced by convenience. Because the moment a system becomes too good at hiding consequences, it begins reshaping behavior in ways that are almost impossible to reverse. Drivers didn't become careless overnight. They became conditioned, trained to expect correction instead of cultivating anticipation. And that shift happened gradually enough to feel natural rather than dangerous. This feature didn't steal control aggressively. It accepted it politely. By intervening early, smoothly, and invisibly, it removed the small moment of discomfort where learning usually occurs, replacing them with reassurance that felt like progress but functioned like dependency. Drivers grew faster, but not wiser, more confident, but less prepared. When the system worked, it felt like mastery. When it didn't, the gap it exposed felt shocking. That gap is now written into modern design philosophy. Manufacturers no longer ask only how much assistance a system can provide. They ask how clearly it communicates limits, how deliberately it returns responsibility, how early it teaches restraint instead of correcting excess. Because performance without understanding creates fragile capability, impressive on the surface and vulnerable underneath. This feature forced the industry to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the most dangerous moment is not losing control, but believing control was never in question. That the handover between machine and human must be felt, not hidden, and that drivers cannot be protected from responsibility without eventually being unprepared for it. Today's systems speak louder. They intervene earlier. They warn more clearly, not because drivers demanded it, but because this feature showed what happens when silence is mistaken for safety. It wasn't removed because it was flawed. It was redefined because it worked too well. And its real legacy is not faster cars or cleaner lap times, but renewed understanding that assistance should guide growth, not replace it. Because when machines do everything for us, we stop knowing who is really in control. So what do you think? Are modern performance systems making us better drivers, or are they quietly teaching us how to rely instead of learn? The